like it was a dream that has somehow faded into memory and it will never be the same again.
We're going to go in and clear it, make sure, and we'll have other people that we find locate into there.
All of this here?
Let's let Ross take the lead and we'll do it systematically because I have no idea where we're going.
Michael Jackson's secret vault finally opened, and what investigators found inside is beyond imagination, shaking everything fans thought they knew about the King of Pop. Behind the locked doors were not just forgotten items, but haunting echoes of brilliance, ambition, and unfinished genius left frozen in time. It's a discovery that feels less like uncovering history and more like opening a door to something deeply emotional, almost tragic. For years, strange stories followed Michael Jackson long after the music stopped. Not stories about awards, sold-out stadiums, or world records. People already knew those stories. These were different. These were stories about locked rooms, sealed storage spaces, coded boxes, and private collections that very few people were allowed to touch. The strange part is that these stories never completely disappeared. They kept resurfacing over the years because people who spent time around Michael kept repeating the same thing. Producers said it. Former employees said it. People working quietly behind the scenes said it. Michael Jackson saved almost everything. Now think about that for a second. What happens when one of the most famous human beings in history spends decades storing away pieces of his life? Not money, not jewelry, not expensive gifts, pieces of himself. Because Michael wasn't like most people. Most of us lose ideas every day without even noticing. A thought enters our minds and disappears a few minutes later. Michael seemed almost afraid of letting ideas disappear. Former collaborators described something unusual about him. They said music didn't only come to him during recording sessions or while sitting inside a studio. It came at random moments, during travel, during conversations, late at night. Producer after producer described similar situations where Michael would suddenly stop and say he heard something, a melody, a sound, a rhythm, and if he felt it mattered, everything else stopped. Some claimed he would call people in the middle of the night because he didn't want an idea escaping before morning. Think about that for a moment. How many ideas passed through Michael Jackson's mind over 40 years? Hundreds? Thousands? Or something much bigger? Because every idea seemed to lead somewhere. A note written on hotel paper, a sentence scribbled inside a notebook, a rough melody recorded on a cassette. One page became 10, 10 became hundreds.
There were some different sides to him. There was a kind side to him, and yet there was a dark side. And I feel that he was a manipulator.
And after enough years pass, collections stop looking like collections. They start becoming archives. And archives slowly begin feeling like vaults. But here's where the story starts changing. While all of this was happening quietly behind closed doors, another version of Michael Jackson stood in front of the world. The version everybody knew. The glove, the moonwalk, the screaming crowds. By the late 1980s, Michael Jackson wasn't simply successful. Success almost feels like the wrong word. Thriller would eventually become the best-selling album in history, with estimated sales crossing more than 70 million copies worldwide. His concerts pulled enormous crowds. Millions of records moved across countries. Money flowed from music, films, merchandise, tours, and licensing deals. From the outside, it looked like a life nobody could fully understand. But here is the question almost nobody was asking. What was Michael building while everybody was busy watching the stage? Because something much bigger was happening.
But I came across the briefcase that had like pornographic materials in it. That was consistent with what the victim stated.
In 1985, Michael made a move that shocked people inside the industry. He spent nearly $47.5 million buying ATV Music Publishing. At first, many thought they understood what happened. They didn't, because this wasn't simply about buying songs. That purchase gave him ownership rights connected to more than 4,000 songs, including music associated with the Beatles' catalog. Suddenly, the performer people watched on television wasn't simply singing music anymore. He was owning it, quietly, carefully, piece by piece. And slowly, people began realizing something uncomfortable. Maybe they had been looking at Michael Jackson the wrong way all along, because behind the glove, behind the dance moves, and behind the stage lights, there was another Michael Jackson almost nobody saw. The businessman, the collector, the builder. And then there was Neverland.
An arrest warrant has been issued for Michael Jackson, is sending shockwaves through the entertainment industry.
It was a major police raid on Neverland. They found porn, creepy statues, rotten meat, and mess everywhere.
Most people called it a mansion, but that word never really explained it. Neverland wasn't built like a house. It felt more like an escape from reality itself. There were rides, movie theaters, animals, gardens, and entire spaces built around fantasy. But sometimes the most important parts of a place are not the parts people can see. It's the places hidden behind doors. And years later, that raised another question. If Michael Jackson spent his entire life building worlds, what exactly was hidden inside them? Because investigators weren't simply finding objects, they were finding traces of a mind that never seemed to stop moving. And the deeper people looked, the stranger things became. And this is where the story starts becoming stranger, because Neverland was already unusual from the outside. People saw amusement rides, movie theaters, animals, gardens, and a place that looked almost disconnected from reality. To most people, it felt like a giant playground, a place built from imagination rather than concrete and steel. But the strange thing about places like that is this: what people see is usually only part of the story. The real questions often begin behind closed doors. Over the years, stories continued circulating about restricted sections inside Neverland and private storage areas that only a small circle of people had access to. These weren't places visitors casually walked into. These weren't rooms people wandered through during tours. They sat quietly in the background, almost forgotten by everyone except the people who knew they existed. And naturally, people began asking questions. Because what exactly do you keep hidden when you've already shown the world almost everything? As years passed, reports described storage spaces and warehouses containing thousands of items packed away into crates and boxes. Not dozens, not hundreds. Thousands. And suddenly the mystery became larger because people weren't talking about ordinary things.
Because there were children's statues inside this little hallway that then led to the larger room. As we started to search, I came across a package of sausage that was just like it was like pepperoni sausage, just in a little plastic bag.
They were talking about vintage toys, movie props, rare books, artwork, unusual antiques, and stage costumes from different eras of Michael's life. Now at first, that might sound like somebody who simply liked collecting things. But the deeper people looked, the less ordinary it seemed. Because Michael didn't appear to collect objects the way most people do. Most people buy things they like. Michael seemed to collect things that made him feel something. That is very different. One moment there could be items connected to old Hollywood history, then fantasy pieces, then childhood objects, then rare artifacts carrying stories from entirely different periods of time. Walking through parts of these collections reportedly felt less like entering storage and more like stepping into someone's private world. And beneath all of it, there was something strangely emotional hiding in plain sight. Because if you look closely, a pattern started appearing. Michael spent much of his life surrounded by pressure, cameras, expectations, and attention. But the things he seemed drawn toward often pointed somewhere else entirely. Fantasy, wonder, childhood, escape, almost as if he was trying to preserve something the world had taken from him long ago. And just when the collections themselves were becoming the mystery, another question quietly moved into the background. Because among all the costumes, artwork, and forgotten objects, insiders repeatedly pointed towards something else, something much more valuable: the music. And suddenly everything changed. Because finding old collectibles is one thing. Finding unheard Michael Jackson recordings is something completely different. Now the atmosphere becomes heavier. Because Michael Jackson and perfection seemed to exist in a relationship that bordered on obsession. A producer could tell him a song sounded incredible. Michael could listen for a few seconds and decide something still felt wrong. Then the process started again. Vocals changed, lyrics changed, sounds changed, entire sections changed, again and again and again. Some collaborators described him recording ideas years before they finally found a place. Think about that for a moment. Most artists create for the album in front of them. Micheal sometimes seemed to create for a future only he could see. And that raises a strange question. How many songs never reached the world? Dozens? Hundreds? How many melodies were recorded and quietly placed away somewhere?
I came across those items, and that's when I was able to book them into evidence, and then later testified on that evidence. A victim comes in and states, these are the facts.
Because stories surrounding recording sessions suggested there were alternate takes, demos, incomplete ideas, and experimental sounds that audiences never heard. Some reportedly moved into directions people wouldn't even associate with Michael Jackson. Different sounds, different styles, different concepts, fragments of creativity sitting in silence. And perhaps that became the real mystery. Because maybe the biggest question wasn't what Michael Jackson released. Maybe it was what he chose not to. But then investigators and archivists reportedly encountered something even more personal than music. Not records, not costumes, not collections, pages, handwritten pages. And suddenly the mystery changed once again. Because some of those ideas looked less like songs and more like blueprints. Blueprints for worlds that never existed. If you think Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch was just a house with a few rides and a big gate, you're only seeing the surface. Because once you step into what people actually described inside that place, it stops feeling like a normal celebrity estate and starts feeling like a parallel universe built out of childhood memories, obsession, and pure imagination. And yeah, the word collection doesn't even feel big enough for it. Let's start with the obvious one first, because nothing about Neverland ever actually starts simple. Michael Jackson didn't just have toys, he had what you could only call a full-scale lost childhood archive. Not the kind you put in a box in the attic. We're talking life-size arcade machines, vintage-style rides, and toys that look like they escaped from a theme park and decided to never leave. Inside the arcade area, there were those old-school riding horses you'd normally find outside grocery stores. Except here, they weren't just one or two. They were part of a whole setup. Nearby, you'd find miniature cars you could actually drive, including themed ones that looked like they belonged in a cartoon rather than a ranch in California. It wasn't subtle. It was intentional chaos. The good kind if you're a kid, the surreal kind if you're an adult walking through it. And then there were the full-scale props. Not models, not replicas, real functioning amusement-style machines. Fortune tellers, oversized games, and random nostalgic pieces that made the whole place feel like someone took every childhood memory from different decades and dumped it into one estate. But here's where it gets even more unusual. Michael Jackson also had a fascination with vehicles, not in a luxury car collection way like most celebrities. His collection was more like, why does this exist and how did it end up here? Territory. There were vintage cars, retrofitted vehicles, even novelty machines that looked like they belonged in a movie set. Some reports described him driving around the ranch in unusual toy-like cars just for fun, like he was intentionally shrinking the adult world down to child size whenever he could. And that's kind of the pattern you start to notice. Everything in Neverland was scaled for emotion, not logic. Even the trains. Yes, plural. He had miniature railway systems running through the property, complete with stations and themed locomotives. One of them was even named after his mother, which adds a strangely personal layer to all this playfulness. It wasn't just decoration. It felt like he was building a world he could actually move through, stop in, escape into whenever he wanted. But the strange collections weren't only physical objects. They were themes, because Neverland also reportedly had an unusual fascination with imagery, especially anything tied to innocence, fantasy, or childhood symbolism. That's where things start to feel more complicated. Posters, paintings, sculptures, and decorative pieces around the estate often leaned heavily into Peter Pan-style fantasy worlds, children's imagery, and dreamlike visuals. It wasn't random decoration. It was a consistent aesthetic identity. Like he wasn't just living in a house, he was living inside a story he was constantly trying to preserve. And of course, people always mention the animals, not just a pet dog or two. Neverland had its own private zoo-like setup at one point. Exotic animals, giraffes, elephants, flamingos, and more were part of the estate's early identity. For a while, it genuinely felt like a private safari mixed with an amusement park. Visitors later said that walking through the place felt like reality didn't know what genre it was supposed to be in. One minute you're near a carousel, the next you're seeing exotic animals. Then you turn a corner and there's a movie theater or a train station. It didn't follow rules, it followed imagination. And that's what makes the collection idea so strange. Because it was never just about owning things, it was about building a feeling. A place where everything from toys to trains to animals to decorations was curated to recreate something he felt he missed growing up. That's why people often describe Neverland less like a mansion and more like a living psychological landscape. Every object had a role in that world, even if outsiders didn't fully understand the logic behind it. And maybe that's why people still talk about it so much. Because you don't forget a place that feels like it was built out of memory instead of architecture. Even if you don't fully understand it, you remember it. And Neverland was designed in a way where forgetting it was never really an option. When people imagine Michael Jackson's vault, they expect gold, rare jewels, maybe even some secret contracts hidden in the dark. But the real discovery wasn't anything that sparkles. It was fragments, unfinished songs, half-shaped ideas, sketches of performances that never made it to the stage, little echoes of imagination frozen in time. Because his real empire wasn't built on money at all, but on creativity that never stopped expanding. What remained wasn't a treasure chest. It was a mind still mid-conversation with the world. Perhaps the most unbelievable thing hidden inside Michael Jackson's vault wasn't what he left behind, but how much of him the world never truly knew. What if the greatest Michael Jackson song ever created is still sitting somewhere in silence?